Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Counter-programming August continues apace. Bunch of people have asked me why I haven't had our guest on and why we haven't talked about more about sex and gender stuff. And so, obviously, the Venn diagrams overlap perfectly with Carole Hooven, who is a non-resident senior fellow at AEI. Which I had not known until earlier this summer, and that's bad on me. I've been so busy. But she was very famous for being at Harvard for quite a long time, teaching human evolutionary biology and whatnot. We can ask her exactly what she taught and why and all that. She wrote a book that a lot of listeners have recommended to me called T, The Story of Testosterone, the Hormone That Dominates and Divides Us. I almost left that out. And she's written a bunch of places. We'll put all of this in the show notes. Carole, welcome to the Remnant.
Thank you so much for having me.
So listeners know that you're not technically on a book tour, but I've yet to meet an author who doesn't like to sell books.
Sure.
So my normal rule when I have an author on a book tour is I ask them the question that I always want to get asked when I'm on a book tour, and rarely do. What's your book about? So I figure we could sort of start there in terms of why did you write a book about testosterone?
T.
What about T?
I just happen to have it right here.
As someone who grew up on the Electric Company's Adventures of Letterman, I like the cover. Yeah. So why did you write about T? What is its role in the larger conversation? And why is the role of testosterone even a controversial subject?
Great. Thank you. Okay, that's a lot of big questions.
And you can go anywhere you want with it. It's a free-for-all here.
So I'll just start with what I just did.
Mm-hmm.
I am 59 and I use HRT and estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. I take the, quote, female hormones, although females also have testosterone, but we, often call progesterone and estrogen the female hormones. I take those in pill form, and I rubbed my testosterone gel on my ankle, and it's prescribed off label for females of my age, for postmenopausal females. But what I have to do is I have a tube, which represents the amount that a man would rub on himself in a day. Mm-hmm. And I'm supposed to take 1/10 of that. And that is and when I get it wrong, which sometimes I get a little overly enthusiastic if I'm going to do resistance training that night or something, I'm like, ooh, I'll just put a little more on. And then I'll get some side effects like acne or maybe a little dark hair where I don't want it. And I'm just starting off with that because I just did that when I got out of the shower. But it's also a nice way of representing what the difference is between males and females in terms of testosterone level. It's basically, we have at minimum 1/10. Men have at least 10 times the amount of testosterone than women do. And what a lot of people don't know is that these differences in testosterone exposure start in the womb. So I had a boy, he's 16 now, and the amazing sort of bizarre I cry a lot. I'm already tearing up thinking about being pregnant with him, which is ridiculous, but that's what I do.
Estrogen will do that to you.
Yeah, exactly. It does. And ask me about that later, because people who transition from, say, female to male, or male, a gender transition from living in a female social role to living in a male social role, they experience the emotional changes you would predict when they, if females take male typical levels of testosterone and males block testosterone and take estrogen. So that crying really is something that has to do with not being exposed to testosterone across development. So I'm just starting out with this detail about the critical stages, because it's not just that adults differ starting from puberty in the levels of these hormones. It's that our differences start in very important ways in utero, and that stems from the difference in the sex chromosomes. So females have XX sex chromosomes and males have XY sex chromosomes, and the possession of the Y chromosome leads to the development of testicles rather than ovaries. And the testicles, very soon after conception, a few weeks after conception, start pumping out very high levels in terms of concentration. It's a pubertal levels, pubertal concentration in the fetus. And that's what was going on inside of me when I was pregnant with a boy. His little testes are extremely active during this early stage. And what's so important is that testosterone exposure, of course, is what's responsible for the development of the male reproductive system, internal and external genitalia, but also it pairs the hormone, in essence, because of its its evolutionary function, pairs that male reproduction system, which involves sperm production. That's what defines a male organism, is sperm production, and females produce eggs. So small mobile gametes versus large immobile gametes. There has to be a phenotype, a full behavioral and physical phenotype that is coupled with the ability to produce sperm, and generally the need to compete for mates, find the mates and compete for the mates in ways that females don't necessarily, on average, across a bunch of different species. And this characterizes humans. So the effects on the brain and the body are permanent. And this is in order to sort of create a developmental pathway that differentiates from the female pathway in order to support the reproductive needs of males versus females. Females don't really need any specific sex hormones in that early development, but males do in order to sort of travel down that male pathway. And then, of course, as kids, you can see the effects, because boys, for one thing, kids like to play. You can just see that the behavior of children is already significantly differentiated. And that's not because of social influences. That's largely because of hormonal influences. And part of how we know that is we see the same differences in non-human animals. We know it's you can manipulate that play type by manipulating early exposure to hormones. We see males loving to wrestle, little boys loving to wrestle each other all over the world. So it's really not contingent on specifics of human culture. And we know that it's mediated by testosterone. And this is all occurring in the absence of significant hormonal differences in children. It is evidence that these effects on the brain are permanent. So anyone who tells you that sex differences in human behavior, in any sort of fundamental, widespread aspect of human behavior, they tell you they are purely social, and there's lots of mostly feminist scholarship that outright denies the influence of biology in many sex differences in behavior. And there's just no basis for that. Of course, culture is important. We have gendered cultures. We have sex roles in societies that are very important. But those sex roles are related to our biological functions, to reproduction, to the fact that females have the babies, we nurse the babies. That alone places constraints on what can happen socially. So I wrote the book to defend that point of view and to present the evidence in what I hope and have been told is an engaging way, that humans are not so different from other animals in the effect of hormones and biology and evolution in shaping our differences. But of course, what really matters is that you and I can have this conversation. I also start tearing up about this. We can have these conversations. We need to have these conversations. It's becoming harder and harder to have these conversations and to talk about the biology. And this view is stigmatized. So I wrote the book to defend the point of view and argue for the importance of being able to speak freely. I have chills because I risked a lot to defend this view, and I will defend it until I die, that learning how the world works, gathering facts, having the right to speak about them and debate them freely in an open environment, because there are important public policy implications, especially about the reality of being male and female for obvious reasons that I hope I don't have to explain to this audience. So that's why I wrote the book. That's what it's about. The example I gave about play, you know, something like that, I would go into a fair amount of interesting scientific, I think fascinating scientific detail about exactly how that works, what the evidence is, what the implications are.
Yeah, I mean, I remember first reading about the sex differences stuff when Christina Hoff Sommers, our AEI colleague, came out with her War Against Boys
She's
book.
She's been a huge hero and inspiration.
Yeah, and she would talk about how these studies all over the place where you give boys Barbie dolls and they splay one leg down and turn them into a pistol, right? And so I mean, we should back up because that was a good survey, sort of the warp and woof of things. Just so for level setting for listeners, you subscribe to gametic theory, right? Is that how you say it? Gametic, as in gamete?
Sure, you could. The gametic view. It's not even a theory. It's just the idea that there's two sexes, male and female, and that the way that what sex is something like a body plan to produce sperm or eggs, or in some organisms, of course, both. It's just that regardless of what we call them, then the words that we use, this is in fact what exists in nature. Is that sexual reproduction involves the union of sperm and eggs, and the organisms that produce either sperm or eggs are identified as either male or female. Or they can be both, or they can be sequential, you know, start one sex and then become the other in certain fish, or etc. But that's what the gametic view or gametic definition.
I didn't mean theory in the sense that it's just a hypothesis. I mean, my understanding, partly from you, is that it's sort of like the basic science of this. Point,
these are just facts. These have been well-established facts for a long time, and now, because of social and political reasons, not because of scientific reasons, as far as I can see, this idea of two sexes is challenged.
But just again, for setting the table for people, the gametic view was once controversial, like in the 19th century, right? The Lamarckians and those kinds of people wanted to believe that you could pass on behavior genetically to your kids.
But that's a separate issue. That's a separate issue. Lamarckism is just about how we inherit various traits.
Right. And my understanding, I used to know a lot more about eugenics, and there were arguments about, you know, germplasm theory and where heredity comes from and all these kinds of things. And the only reason I bring it up is that it feels like the argument about the gender stuff it's this weird thing where in the 19th century, in the early 20th, the eugenicists claimed the mantle of science while peddling pseudoscience. And it feels like we're in a similar kind of place now, where the sort of the literary theorist view of gender is claiming to have a better command of the science than the conventional,
That's correct.
Let me ask it this way. So what you say about human sexuality and gender, and at some point you got to explain to me. I went to a feminist college where I was pounded over the head constantly about the differences. A place called Goucher College, where I was one of the first men ever admitted to an all-women school.
Good move.
Yeah, it had its ups and downs.
Okay.
I read a lot more Foucault than Federalist Papers, I can tell you. So, but I was always beaten over the head with this difference between sex and gender stuff, and it feels like the gender has just simply won this argument that you use gender for both sex and gender, and it's kind of a Mott and Bailey argument where the people who beat you up about it can hide and change the meaning of the word to sort of put you on defense at all times.
Sorry, I have to make a plug because you're bringing up, this is my husband. He wrote a book on this issue.
Most people are going to be listening to this rather than watching. So the
Trouble
book she's
with Gender by Alex Byrne is exactly on that question. And he knows a lot more about it than I do. So what I know, I think I've mostly learned from him talking about all these issues. He's a philosopher, but he's gotten into this issue about how philosophy and feminist philosophy in general has been handling the kinds of questions that you just asked about
Right.
gender. So there's one issue is how do we refer to these reproductive categories where organisms produce sperm or eggs? So their gender can be confusing because does it mean actual sex or does it mean something else that is, in my view, and I think his view, not well defined? So one argument is to do away with gender altogether because it just doesn't have a consistent meaning. But I think the reality is, of course, that there is the sex act. We
Mhm.
can use the word sex for that, clearly. There is sex, meaning male or female. And then there is this more nebulous concept, which to me, there are other words that would be very useful and more specific to talk about people's sense of what I think fundamentally it has to do with sex role, where they feel more comfortable
Mhm.
socially. And it really, I think, helps clarify discussions about what gender identity is, because that's also something that is not well defined, but it's sort of taken for granted that it's some sort of nugget that exists, where if that doesn't match your quote sex assigned at birth, that's also I think not a clear concept. You are one sex or the other, especially in mammals. That's always true. Almost, with exceedingly few exceptions. You are one sex or the other. So the idea that there is something in your brain or your body or somewhere else that where you are another sex actually, and your body is mismatched, that is in my view, an incoherent idea with no scientific evidence. What is real and is a problem and needs to be dealt with is when people, so take little boys who are likely to grow up would have grown up if they hadn't transitioned. Say a lot of
Mhm.
them are transitioning now. Little boys who are gender nonconforming. And this is tragic in a lot of ways when they are, because they're much more likely to have some feminine characteristics. I wouldn't even say feminine, but really not conforming with the sort of typical boy rough behavior that I was just talking about. There's a preference for sort of girly things, for hanging out with the girls. Those little boys can feel exceedingly uncomfortable in that, what the expectations for male behavior are. And I have a huge amount of sympathy for that. And that's something that also gets me upset because they're bullied and they start to hate their body because the penis is the source of all their problems. They're identified as a male. They're expected to act like this, whatever a typical male or masculine is supposed to be. And they convince themselves, and now it's much easier to convince themselves because we have this idea that, oh, your gender identity is mismatched to your sex, and here's some drugs you can take and some surgeries you can have. But this, sorry, I can't even remember.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
okay.
we just
So it's about
gotta
sex and gender. So
yeah.
I'm saying that there are words like being gender nonconforming, sex role. And that's, the expectations that we have for males and females in every society are very sexually differentiated. And many don't allow for the full expression of who you feel you are. And, from my point of view, if a man wants to wear a dress, he should have every right to go ahead and wear a dress. That would be a free society if that makes him comfortable. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he has a female gender identity, because then we have these regressive sort of stereotypes being endorsed very publicly about what it means to be a female, what it means to be a female in any particular society. And I don't think it should mean, wearing a lot of makeup or high heels or having long nails or wearing dresses. If you want to have short hair and wear army boots and drive a truck, that should be completely fine. So I think we need more precise language to describe all these facets of what it means, of how we express ourselves or feel in our sex roles and our sexed bodies, gender is often very unhelpful because people think they know what it means and they try to have conversations, and we're not always on the same page there. And I think it also misleads people about what the motivations for transitioning
Right. I
are.
want to get to the transitioning stuff in a
Yeah.
second, but the only reason I brought it up was because
Sorry, that was a long answer.
that's fine. I have this Pavlovian thing where if I feel I misuse gender, I'll get smacked for it, because I did throughout my college years. And now
Yeah.
the kinds of people who do the smacking are the ones misusing it. I mean, the way I was taught was that sex is essentially a scientific or medical term
Yeah.
that describes the gametic view of this and
Right.
that, and sex organs define the male and female and all that. And gender is a social construct. And so therefore there should be, or that was always what I was told, more play in the concept of gender. But when you go to a gynecologist, the gynecologist should know how to do gynecological things, because it's a science and it's a medicine, and there is actual anatomical and physiological things associated with sex that are just facts, and you're not going to get around them regardless of what your sexual preference is, right? And so the question I wanted to get to, which I sidetracked it by doing the sex versus gender thing, is it is amazing to me how long it's taken for a lot of we can come up with a better term for it if you want, woke, politically correct, postmodern, deconstructionist, whatever, for that stuff to reach the sciences. People, my wife wrote a book about Title IX 20 years ago where she predicted this was heading to the sciences, and everyone made fun of her. And now it's all over the place in the sciences, as your story attests. But I feel like the test for this is there a course that teaches animal physiology, right? So, or animal anatomy, whatever the correct term is, a veterinary school in the country that even touches the idea of gender fluidity in animals, right? Or is it solely a concept that we are applying to human beings, and then stealing sort of anecdata from the natural world every now and then to corroborate what is a social argument about human beings? I'm trying to get to someplace, but has this thing leaped the barrier into other parts of science yet, or medical science?
Yeah, yes, definitely into medical science, I would say. But in terms of non-human animals, I would say all of the sciences that have to do with behavior and physiology have been infected to some degree. Because scientific publishing has really taken a nose dive.
Yeah.
So I think there is more, and I think it's the idea of something like sex roles or whatever you call gender, in animals is kind of interesting. And, why shouldn't that be something that's explored? But of course, there's no intention in animals to create any kind of sex roles. They don't have laws about clothing or behavior or anything. They just evolve naturally, and most especially mammals are extremely sexually differentiated. Males and females usually don't even hang out together unless the females are fertile, and then the males are very interested. I don't know if that's actually
my point is, is there anybody trying to make the claim that for bonobos, or because I know bonobos, there are certain primate species where the female is dominant. That's fine. They're whatever.
Okay, thank you. Good.
Yeah, no, it's totally fine. But my point is, but my point is when people are trying to teach about dolphins or bonobos or orangutans or whatever, no one's trying to say in those spheres of life, well, sex is a spectrum, right? It is.
No, it's definitely more difficult to talk about sex differences in non-human animals, and the terms are changing. I don't know exactly what's going on right now, but I know when I left Harvard and spoke to some researchers who are in primatology, there were issues talking about certain sex-based differences in non-human primates, for instance. So I do believe that's still going on. It is an issue.
So because what I'm trying to get at, sort of tying it to the eugenics point from earlier, and a lot of us feel, what was it the Soviets called it? Lysenkoism, right?
Yes.
There's this sort of politicization of the sciences, and I find it very, very frustrating coming from the people who normally say follow the science, right? On climate change, you must absolutely believe these climate modelers, but how dare you believe evolutionary biologists? And that's the frustration that I'm getting
Yeah,
at, is that it
it is
feels
frustrating.
like, and I have lots of criticism for the people who refuse to believe climate scientists about anything, but I also have a lot of frustration for people who like tell me that uh there are all the, I mean, you get all these crazy triggering quotes in the coverage of this stuff about how you should just it's like, well, birthing person and all of these kinds of things, or
Oh yeah.
pregnant men and all that, and it's like an actual doctor who believes men can get pregnant, you should look hard at their license, right? I mean, that's my issue with it.
Well, it's that men now don't mean necessarily adult human male, and women don't necessarily mean adult human female. So we have this erosion of clear language, which just makes it difficult to communicate, especially across difference, which is what we need now more than ever, potentially.
All right, so let me steel man the other side of this. I have friends who are transgender. They're not. I mean, there are people I know who are transgender. I treat them with respect. I call them by the name that they choose, because that's what I would do with anybody.
Right.
Your name is your name, and I know people who've changed their name. Right. I know people who've gotten remarried and their last name changes. I don't stick to their old name. I would still like to call Bombay, but there are places where you can go with this. Anyway, what is so terrible about, so what's the downside of a policy of sort of cultural tolerance that says we should make room for these people to live the way that they want to live? Like, where are your bright lines to say this far but no farther?
Okay, so I have my own personal views, and which are different probably from a lot of people whose views I respect and understand, but they're in some ways. I'll just explain. Okay, so I basically agree with you personally. Mm-hmm. I use preferred pronouns. I know a lot of trans people. What matters to me is that we are allowed to have all the conversations we need to have and to use clear language so that we can have debates, potentially publicly, about what sex-based policies and law should be. And from my point of view, as long as that's allowed to happen and we rely on democratic processes, I think we're in pretty good shape. But what is happening is there's a lot of bullying from extreme trans rights activists that inhibit that process. And that's what I have a problem with. So I think the issues that really matter in law are, first of all, how do we define sex in law? So under Biden, it included gender identity, which nobody even knew was happening. And then when Trump issued his executive order defining sex as male and female based on gametes, people freaked out. I'm a Democrat. I'm still a Democrat. My tribe freaked out, and I wrote an article for the Boston Globe arguing that Trump actually has the definition right, and that sex does in fact matter. And it's not. So when if I were to go to prison and say I had a history of sexual assault, the last thing I would want is for a male to be in my prison cell. And if we in the law define sex as gender identity, which has happened, and we now have female identifying males in prison cells with females. So whatever you think of that, we need to have the words and the ability to let people know that that is happening, and to have reasonable discussions about what the law should be without being called transphobic. So that's one issue. Of course, there's the issue of female sports, where I think we also need a clear definition of male and female to be able to have that discussion, because there are obvious advantages for males in sports, regardless, your identification doesn't matter in terms of who has a physical advantage. It may matter in terms of social policy if we want to do this for social reasons to, increase inclusivity or whatever. But then there's the social issue, like you were talking about. Why can't we just sort of let people live their lives, use their preferred pronouns? That's basically my view, except there is an argument there that doing that, say always use, like if the New York Times, okay, oh, sorry, I just saw an article, okay, on this young trans woman, 17 years old, who is identified in this article as a woman, which is fine. However, this is a male person who is raised male, who at 17 solved some centuries old mathematical equation or whatever. And mathematicians all over the world were totally freaked out. But and we also have articles in the newspaper referring to murderers, heinous, violent murderers who've done really atrocious things to women, identifying them as women who did these crimes. In both of those domains, the public is being misled about what it means to be a woman, in essence, because it is a fact that men have more accomplishments in that kind of mathematical domain. It would be it's exceptional to start with for a 17-year-old, but for a 17-year-old for a young woman who's 17, that would be a whole other accomplishment that we learned about, that, hey, women can do this thing. But it's not a woman, it's a trans woman. But you would never know that from reading the article. And you would never know from reading the New York Times or a bunch of the Guardian or other papers that I don't know if it's in the New York Times anymore. There's a lot of this in the UK where these murderers are described as women. So my point is that we do lose something when we, by default, do whatever we can to make people feel comfortable, which is a good thing. You want everybody to feel comfortable. But there are effects on something like data collection if we don't know who is male and female, because in law and socially we use people's preferred pronouns, and data is actually collected on murder rates or SAT scores without recording sex, and instead recording something like gender identity or how people self-identify in their forms. We're losing the ability to know what's true about male and female capacities and behavior, et cetera. And sorry, when I say capacities, I'm talking about on average, just average differences. Yeah. Obviously, there's a huge amount of variation there.
So Confucius has this great thing about how if he was asked, what would you do if you were put in charge? And he says, I would call for the rectification of the names. And what he means by that is, he says society's in disharmony when the words we use for things don't describe the things that as they are. And I'm very sympathetic to that, and not just in this area, but in a whole realm of things. The language stuff drives me kind of crazy, because there is this tendency to think if we can just relabel things, the sort of George Lakoff view, right? If we could just relabel things, that will yield reality. Don't call them trial lawyers, call them community protection attorneys, and then all of a sudden people will like trial lawyers, or
administrative assistants instead of secretary.
Yeah. Or Lakoff, one of his other ones was don't call taxes, call them dues, or something like that.
Yeah, I think Steve Pinker calls it, is it the euphemism treadmill? I'm not sure if
something like that.
Some treadmill where you just it keeps changing because it doesn't work, because the thing is still what it is.
Well, that's the point I'm getting to, is that the second you make any concession to reality, scientific reality or the scientific fact, and say someone, so and so identifies as female, you might as well be calling them trans, right? Because people know what that's a euphemism for. And I mean, I don't mean to be sexist or gross or anything like that, but like
Here it comes.
but here it comes. When you see that somebody described as body positive, you know
they're
that
obese.
they're you know that they are not a stereotypical Victoria's Secret model, right?
Okay.
There's something going on, right? And people aren't dumb, and they figure out these cues. And the journalists know this, and the editors know this, and so you end up in this place where if we give any nod to the underlying ground truth, we are undermining the thing that we're trying to do. And so you get this tension where people start just ignoring the ground truth entirely. And that's true on a whole range of things. And I'm just sort of from the journalistic school that says, tell the truth. And you can tell the truth in lots of different ways, and you don't have to be cruel about it. And you don't have to be insensitive about it, but tell the truth where and when at the very least where it matters. And I feel like a lot of our problems in our society these days are driven by elite overproduction of humanities majors.
Okay.
But that's neither here nor there. I do have to ask you, because every time this issue comes up, people will say, "What about intersex?"
Yeah.
I have my answers, but my answers have much less authority than your answers. So what about intersex?
What do you think, I'm curious. I'd like you to say first what you think.
Sure. So the argument
about it.
The argument you always hear, or I always hear, is I say sex is a binary, and they'll say, well, that's not actually true. There are some people who are born, intersex or hermaphrodite. There are a bunch of these sort of in the middle terms, or both and terms rather than either or terms. And that happens in nature, and that happens with humans. And I'm deeply sympathetic to those individual cases. But my argument is that is a pretty thin mule to hitch an entire theory about reorganizing understandings of sex differences to. It is not a huge scientific foundation for it. And regardless, the term intersex means between the sexes, right? It literally upholds the sex binary and says, here's this rare exception that is between the two the sex binary. And right. And so I don't think, and I get uncomfortable talking about it in the sex concept, but I talk about this in all sorts of other realms. Making the exceptions the standard for a generalized rule gets you in trouble in all sorts of realms of life. So intersex, why does intersex happen? What is intersex?
Okay.
What damage, if any, does it do to your claim of the gametic view? Yada, yada, yada.
All right. I'm going to start by saying, okay, again, I get very emotional about this. This is not a surprise. I know this is what I used to do when I taught about this stuff, because these conditions are conditions that affect real people. They are very often exceedingly difficult to manage medically. They are misunderstood. People are stigmatized. They go through surgeries they didn't want. Sex is so important as a category socially that to be born, so intersex conditions are, some people advocate for that term, but it is misleading because they're almost never people who are, quote, between sexes. These are generally male or female DSDs. A DSD is a difference or disorder of sexual development. And okay, so I just want to get that out there. These are conditions that need to be understood. These people need support. And we just need to remember that when we have these conversations. And they don't love having their conditions or suite of conditions. This happens all the time. People bring this up. Well, these people are evidence that there are more than two sexes, or that the sex binary isn't real. That they think they're doing the right progressive thing by talking about that. But of course, it's not progressive from the point of view of the people who are living with these conditions, who generally identify. They may sort of, for social reasons, identify as intersex to advocate for their for a cause, but generally they live their lives as male or female. And would be fairly easy to classify as male or female. Okay, so there's a difference between sex and sex-associated traits. And this is where a lot of the pushback to the sex binary happens, is people say, well, there is no sex binary because there are some females who have XY sex chromosomes, or there are some males who have what seems to be a vagina instead of a penis and testicles. There are some males who don't have any testosterone action and look very female and live their lives as female and have breasts. And all of those things are true. But that will be the evidence that people invoke to support the sex is a spectrum idea. Agustin Fuentes is a professor at Princeton who argues something along these lines. He just came out with a book entitled Sex is a Spectrum. And what, in my view, and the view of many other biologists, is that this is just a conflation between sex, the definition of sex that applies consistently and powerfully to predict a lot of other aspects of phenotype across sexually reproducing organisms. It works. It's always worked. No one has ever effectively found any flaws in this definition. But now you have this idea that because of DSDs, because of variation in all kinds of traits,
DSD,
the disorders or differences of sex development, which I will talk about more in just a sec, that because there are XX people who have a very large clitoris that can look like a penis or something like that, that means that person is between sex, but as you noted, that still doesn't mean there's a third or fourth or fifth sex, or that sex is on a spectrum. Just because an individual has sex-associated traits that do exist on somewhat of a spectrum, right? So your behavior, your beard, hips or breasts, or height or parenting style, or how you identify, all of those things are on a spectrum and they are strongly associated with sex. However, the fact that those things, even genitals, can vary does not diminish the idea that there are still two reproductive categories. There are still organisms that produce sperm and eggs. I don't produce eggs anymore, but that doesn't mean I'm not female. So the fact that, even if I took a lot of testosterone and started growing a beard and started passing as a man, that doesn't invalidate the binary category. So DSDs, there are, Caster Semenya is a South African runner who's gotten a lot of attention and has been under scrutiny for, this has been all over the news for a long time, for not being female. Although I use the she pronoun because that's what she prefers. So this is somebody who has, and this has been verified, a DSD called 5-alpha reductase deficiency, and there is an overrepresentation in female sports of males. These are male people with XY sex chromosomes, generally internal testes that produce testosterone and what looks like a vagina. So, but they have male typical behavioral characteristics, and they go through, in terms of the rest of the body and musculature, a male typical puberty, because they do produce and receive and respond to testosterone. So this person might be considered intersex, because this person was raised, these people, depending on where they're raised and if they get if they have sort of modern medical care, but if they're raised in the rural South Africa as a female because of having what looks like a vagina, and then they can run incredibly fast and beat all the other girls easily, this person might very well make it to the Olympics. And this is what we see. And this is part of the issue about having males in female sports. You have people who are male with a DSD, but who are legally female and who identify as female. And then you also have trans women who are male, who block testosterone and take estrogen. So there are two different issues that come up around females in sports. So that DSD is an example. So in the case of Castor Semenya is attracted to women, married to a woman, went through a typical male puberty, has the benefits of testosterone on height and speed and musculature, but did not produce a specific hormone, which is 5-alpha reductase. 5-alpha reductase is the enzyme that converts testosterone into a hormone that is needed to produce the penis. And if you don't have it, you get a vagina instead. So that's what happened to Castor Semenya. But that person, this is a classic, quote, intersex condition. Mm-hmm. That is it's a male who has this condition, and it is not evidence for more than two sexes. So and those conditions represent 0.018 of the population, percent of the population, not 2%, not as common as red hair. That is a total myth, which you probably don't want me to get into the details. I probably talked too much about this other one, but there are other DSDs that are similar. There's one DSD that I wrote about in the book. I had a student who had this particular DSD, who you would never in a million years know is not an XX female. This is complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. So people who are XY, who have internal testicles, but don't respond to testosterone. They produce it. Their testicles still produce testosterone. They don't respond to it. So they have almost a completely female external phenotype, and they go through what looks like, very typical female puberty, because the testosterone they produce is converted into estrogen. They have no body, they have no facial or pubic hair, and I think they have none. Look very feminine. So this is probably the most classic DSD that I would probably call an intersex condition, where I would say this person is a woman personally, even with internal testes that are often removed, which do not necessarily need to be removed. So sorry, it's just a variation on what is typical, and it's not another sex category. It's due to mutations, genetic mutations. Sorry, that's a super long answer.
It's okay. It's all right. So there's internal friction within the LGBTQI, whatever the rest of the letters are, community. And I know some gay people who feel like this stuff has hijacked our thing, and I don't want to get into all that. This is not my area of expertise, but one hears versions of that quite a bit. I am kind of curious, though, just broadly speaking, I think it's fairly settled now that homosexuality is a thing, right? And it is not, well, I grew up in the 1990s where this was still a nature versus nurture argument that was pretty intense, right? It wasn't that long ago where this was still, people didn't dispute that it existed, but where it comes from and what are the drivers of it. I'm inclined to think there's probably more of a spectrum for homosexuality, that some people are just innately born that way, or for all intents and purposes are, and there are other people who maybe aren't. I don't really care at this point. But
you mean whether it's nature or nurture?
Yeah, I think it's probably
especially for females, sexuality is much more flexible. But for males, it seems to be something a little more fixed.
So, but what sort of in the evolutionary biology department? Nothing about today's current public policy stuff. What is the evolutionary explanation?
God,
that reigns, right? Or are you even allowed to have that question asked anymore?
Yeah, you can ask that question carefully, because I am going to say there is no consensus on the explanation. There are some hypotheses. I don't think any of them have much empirical support. Definitely don't. I don't see the empirical support. That, one idea is that these are sort of helpers at the nest who are giving up their own, they're using their sort of reproductive energy budget, to increase the portion of their genes that get into the next generation by helping kin. So this doesn't make sense to me. There was an idea that I think this data has held up. I'm not. I think it's been challenged recently that this is that homosexuality has to do with the uterine environment and the number of. I think it's the uterine environment and number of older brothers. There, I think that's held up. I'm not positive. There's some other explanations. I don't find any of it great, but we do know that there's homosexuality, which almost unique about humans is being exclusively homosexual. We definitely see, like when I was studying chimpanzees in Uganda, I saw plenty of homosexual behavior. What kind of makes sense to me is that males need to form like in the chimps, need to form often extremely strong bonds to defend their territory, just like human males do when they go to war. Those bonds, they are dying for each other, literally dying for each other. And so in the chimps, when there would be conflict between two males, often there would be some sexual contact, like testicle fondling or sort of mock sex, and between two males, which would be a way to resolve conflict, and you're being vulnerable with each other and sort of assuring each other that you can trust the other one. And so I'm not sure if I don't know. I don't. There are sheep that are exclusively homosexual, but I think that there's a lot of homosexuality in the animal kingdom, but in terms, it may be because of human sex roles socially that exclusive homosexuality is more sort of required because there's a space for it. There's an identity and there's a social space for homosexuality. It's very hard for men to, if you're not sort of gay, to be bisexual. That's may become, I think it's becoming more acceptable over time, but so I think there are reasons in humans why maybe we're stricter about sexual orientation. It could be just purely natural. It could be because of policing of male behavior as much, masculine behavior is much stronger than it is for women who can, their sexuality socially, it's much more acceptable for women to be same-sex attracted, I think.
Yeah, I mean, if you go, this gets more into culture and history stuff, but prior to the rise of sort of Christianity, Judeo-Christian values and all that, like in ancient Rome, the sex was much more about who was dominant.
That's right.
Than what the sexes were, right, and all that kind of stuff.
No, that's a really good point. Thank you for bringing it up. So that does suggest more fluidity in male sexual behavior, as long as it's culturally sanctioned. In Papua New Guinea, there was having male homosexual behavior was about dominance, and everybody did it, and so the culture matters a huge amount.
Right. It's sort of, as Tony Soprano says about when dudes are in prison, you get a pass for that.
Right.
But since you brought up, I've successfully managed to steer us towards the culture stuff. Don Brown had that list of human universals, right? These are things that exist in pretty much every culture around, or nearly every culture in the world. And it's all sorts of things: taboos on incest, taboos on, pedophilia. Like you can go down a long list of. It's a list of taboos or things that are encouraged, and all the rest. Are there things that would surprise, going back to tea and all that, that would surprise people that you would argue are, or that you would point out that are cultural traits that are actually much more sex-driven human universals, that these are things that, it's like everywhere in the world so far, my understanding is men are just a lot more interested in pornography than women. That is a constant around the world, and you'll get a certain kind of feminist who will say, "Oh, but I love porn." It's like, okay, that's fine. We're talking about the laws of large numbers here. Go through Pornhub's, customer base, and you'll find,
right. Look at the money. Look at the money.
500 dudes for every one of you. So like this, that's sort of what I'm getting at about this point about taking exceptions to the rule and creating a standard based on the exception rather than the normative thing. But are there traits? So like when we were talking about boys and differences between boys and girls when they're little kids, are there traits that we just sort of conventionally assume are cultural things that you would argue or that you would point out are closer to human universals and are actually much more driven by
conventional is doing a lot of work there.
Fair. That's fair. I mean, again,
I mean, on campus, sure. Like if in feminist scholarship, definitely. But what's interesting is that outside of the academy, most people know exactly what's going on with sex. They do not dispute that men have higher sex drives than women, and that this probably has something to do with nature. It almost certainly does. That's obvious to most people. The fact that there are male and female and only two sexes is obvious to almost everybody. So the fact that boys play rough, all these things are not controversial among regular people who can use their own eyes and are not, stereotypes generally have some basis in truth. And when it comes to sex differences, what may be surprising is the power of culture. Like, given my take on all this and how, I wrote a whole book on how important evolution and biology is. But I think what people need to appreciate is that cultural norms, in addition to things like economic pressures, can have a huge impact on even large patterns of behavior and like data you might see on sex quote equality in different professions. So if you have countries that have a lower HDI, human development index, and there's more stress in the population, whether it be due to threats or food insecurity or whatever it is, you might see that there are more women in engineering than you would expect, that there's sex differences are sort of suppressed because people have to engage in behaviors or enter professions that they might not otherwise, but they are because they're under stress. If you go into like Northern Europe, where say and that might be a place like India. If you go to Northern Europe, where there's people are doing very well, there's high equity across the sexes, there's real strong support for women and openness about their career choices and support for childcare, etc. You see sex differences amplified, and you see more women choosing the heal professions or work that involves people rather than things, for instance. So I guess the surprising thing is that culture. And I also just want to bring up societies that have very strict laws about, say, sexual assault or something. So in all these situations, for the most part, what you would see is, like in Singapore, there are very strict laws about sexual assault. So there you're going to see an extreme reduction in sex differences, because male behavior is kind of being truncated. You're not going to see these extremes of male behavior. You're going to see male behavior being sort of more tightly controlled. And so you'll have smaller sex differences in these countries that are very strict or have potentially stricter gender roles. And you'll see larger sex differences in more sort of open, egalitarian, well-off countries. Often, and not always, but those kinds of things I think are surprising to people, that culture makes that much of a difference. And it does, of course. But ultimately, these patterns where in every country, males are more violent than females, although the nature of that changes, the size of that sex difference changes, it's always pretty much going to be in the same direction. That's biology. It is biology that's shaping these cultural norms, and that requires the laws, the social laws that we have that are to a large extent aimed at reining in male behavior or providing more structure for men, for young men in as they go through adolescence. There are often many societies have rituals that support male development. So in order to channel that kind of masculine energy. So all of that is extremely important, but it's all grounded to some extent in sex differentiated biology. So I think that is what is surprising to people, that it's not just that men have a higher sex drive and are more promiscuous because of biology, or more violent or whatever it is that all of that stuff responds to cultural norms. And that's up to us. That's the thing. That is up to humans, but we need to be able to talk about it in order to figure out how to create, the best society that we can.
Yeah, I mean, Pat Moynihan, made that point in the report on the Negro family in 1965. Is just a vast amount of public policy problems are about males from age 15 to 28. In terms of, I mean, if you just go through the amount of violent crime, if you go through like all the sort of social pathologies, it's really regulating male behavior. That is a vast swath of social disorder problems, and you just can't get around that because that's because of the T thing, right? I teased that I wanted to talk to you about evolutionary psychology because that's one of my interests. And you said you don't know a lot about it.
I know
a
fair amount, but I don't feel I'm an expert. And there are people who really focus on criticizing evolutionary psychology, and I'm not great at that.
I like 80%, 70% of evolutionary psychology. I think there's a lot to it. I mean, it's sort of crazy to talk about the role of testosterone, right, in sex differences, and say that and then psychology based upon those assumptions is stupid, right? So at the same time, the only thing I sort of wanted to ask you about was one of the things I love are inter-academic conflicts. I love hearing about them. I keep telling people that who are better at this stuff than I am, someone needs to write a book about how the history of science the scientific progress was largely driven by people screwing each other and hating each other and competing with each other in very human ways, right?
Yes.
And so anyway, what is, among evolutionary biologists, what is the sort of conventional view about evolutionary psychologists? There's some truth to it, but they're mostly quacks? Is it they're mostly quacks? But what is the, what you guys get into fights? What would be the fight about?
Methods, theory and methods, and testable hypotheses, I think. And the sort of telling of just so stories. So I think there's just a huge range, like in any field, of quality in evolutionary psychology. The problem is when you see every human behavior as having a story, an evolutionary story, and then you create it based on what you observe rather than generating hypotheses based on what you might predict given evolutionary theory and what we see in non-human animals. But I don't, have myself a problem with trying to explain human patterns of human psychology and behavior. Obviously, from an evolutionary point of view, that's what I'm interested in. But again, I don't feel I'm an expert in
That's fine.
this criticism. But what I would like to see more of is a solid evolutionary explanation is going to require using a strong comparative perspective. Humans are not exceptional. We are under the same reproductive pressures and survival pressures in a lot of ways as other animals, and we need to understand. We need to have mechanisms, and we need to have a very strong sort of a priori evolutionary hypothesis. So I think so that's what's so great about testosterone is it's a mechanism that we have in ourselves that we can manipulate, and we can't easily manipulate it in humans, but we can. We have research in non-human primates and mammals that where we can describe what testosterone is doing and why it's doing it from an evolutionary point of view, how this hormone basically helps male animals to increase their reproductive success. And then we can look at how that plays out in humans. But if you don't have, we don't exactly know what it's doing in the brain. We don't have those mechanisms in humans nailed down. Because we can't do the experiment. We can't mess with our genes. We can't take fetuses and manipulate their hormone levels like we do in other animals. And we have very clear data that's consistent with everything we suspect is going on with humans. So in evolutionary psychology, I think some of it's really strong and some of it isn't. And there are people who sort of poo-poo the whole endeavor, and I don't understand that. It's just because there's some weak spots, just like there are anywhere. I think
my favorite example that I think is part of a test you could come up with a testable hypothesis about is human babies are born, particularly the firstborn of a family, are born looking like their father or their grandfather on their paternal side.
Yeah.
So the dad knows it's theirs, right?
Yes.
And like my daughter came out looking like my dad, looked like a little Jewish intellectual from the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Might as well have had a cigar in her mouth. I mean, she looked like it was freaky. And but there's an evolutionary psychology explanation for that makes total sense to me. And you could say you could have predicted that as a testable hypothesis, given what men know, what we know about, and say, I bet you the kids come out, and then lo and behold, that seems to be true. And
but that would be very tough to test because only less than 5% of mammals have investment from the father, actual paternal investment that continues beyond insemination, basically. So, and plus, I think that would be very hard
but
to
for humans, right? Because humans have a very long development, like compared to other mammals. I mean, I'm trying to bring coals to Newcastle telling you these things, but like human babies take a long time before they can defend themselves, right?
Yes.
And so the investment from parents is much more crucial to their survival than it is for baby horses or something, right?
Yes, it is. And it's that's a whole other story about how females, what our adaptations are to keep the males around. And one of them, as you may know, is considered to be concealed ovulation. So we don't have a fertile season where now the males are going to be around and they're going to inseminate us, and then they'll just hope that our kids survive, but they don't know exactly when it is we can get pregnant. So they're likely to hang around. But what's also interesting is that interacting with babies does alter male hormone levels in ways that are beneficial for the mating bond and for the attention to the kid. So men might not even be responsive to their babies in particular until they really interact with them. And it changes we know now that the hormonal changes do change male psychology. Testosterone drops a bit, prolactin and estrogen go up. And these are, that's closer to a female hormone profile. But we have pregnancy and lactation, which does it like that. We become very maternal and like the little mammal sucking on our nipple, which would be a weird thing to like. And most animals wouldn't like that unless they had those hormonal changes. So we're manipulated by our hormones, but also by the environment. It's the presence of the baby and the cues of the baby and the smell of the baby and you're interacting with the baby and your mate that are going to alter your actual chemistry. So there's very tight environment hormone interactions in adulthood where your biology is changing in ways that are adaptive. It's not always great for males to have high testosterone. In birds, they, a lot of birds require biparental care. And when that happens, male testosterone has to be suppressed. If you elevate it, they neglect their offspring. But when testosterone is suppressed, they're able to provide for their offspring, working to get, if you have a birdhouse in your yard, you can see how both the male and female are just working their butts off all day to feed and protect their kids. And for the males, that requires low testosterone. You raise testosterone, he goes out and aggresses with other males and looks for more sex from other females.
there's this finding that I find very depressing about the amount of parental, about family abuse, incest, all these kinds of things, violence from stepfathers, right,
Oh
or
yeah. Yeah.
adoptive fathers, right?
Yeah.
And it speaks very poorly of men that this shows up so pronounced in the data. And I'm wondering, I never really thought about this before, if it has to do with the fact that, like, lacking that new baby smell of knowing that it's your own baby, you don't get the drop in testosterone that you otherwise might, and that makes some men view their kids differently. For boys, it means that they're more of a challenger, right? In that sort of chest beating kind of way. And the girls, maybe that's more of a sexual conquest thing because they're not their own, and that's
Yeah.
actually has to do with hormone levels. I could be completely wrong. I'd never thought
No,
of
that's it. I
that.
mean, so the stepfather is generally, I was raised by a stepfather who came into our family when I was 3. And I just did not have the same bond with him that I had with my biological dad, who I didn't see a lot and I missed, but I think there was a very different bond there. And I hadn't thought about this before, that, which I should have, but that there is, this lasting bond formed when the kid is a little baby, and in those first few years. A lot of marriages break up. If they do break up, they're going to break up at the time when the kid when the baby or babies, whatever, are no longer in that super dependent stage.
Yeah.
So that is interesting. But I just have to comment on the amount, and I'm sure you might have had Richard Reeves on to talk about this, but I have really been looking into the father absence issue and what's going on socially with boys in particular and in non-human animals. Yeah. I just think this is fascinating. So in the 1990s in Johannesburg, South Africa, they created a population of elephants in a national park, and they weren't able to bring the adult males, the bulls, because they were so unmanageable. Mm-hmm. And what happened is, so they had females and a bunch of juveniles. As the juveniles hit puberty, the males' testosterone levels went through the roof, much higher than they would have had the big males been present. There was no dominance hierarchy. There were no big males to put those young males in their place. The young males were super horny and super aggressive and had super high testosterone levels, and went around rampaging, killing rhinos, trampling them, goring them, trying to have sex in a couple occasions with them. So they have all this energy, they have all these drives. And what we need is what evolved naturally, which is a dominance hierarchy. People don't understand how important male dominance is for young males in particular. So when you have a big male, you're challenged by a big male, you realize you're a loser. Because you are a loser. You're small, you're inexperienced, you should just lay low. And when that happens, even in humans, testosterone levels drop in males. So this is like shown across a lot of different species. It's shown in non-human primates. You release that dominance hierarchy, you get rid of the big males, and the young males become, in essence, dominant. They rule the roost, and they have no idea how to control themselves. Nobody's keeping them in line, and it's a disaster. You have the worst of male behavior expressed, and it's supported by a change in testosterone levels. So that, to me, it's not that it's even the fathers, it's having in your community males to kind of take charge, make you wait to learn, to grow and to learn till you can defend, till you have the kind of power and knowledge about how to behave, how to treat females, honestly, like how to have sex, how to treat females. So in humans, we are increasingly seeing the number of households without biological fathers in particular is increasing. And I'm not sure there's enough research on what that does biologically to the boys. We have more on girls and menarche when they begin their periods, when they become sexually active. None of that is helped either by father absence, but it has a much greater effect on male development because the boys aren't sort of respecting their
Yeah.
stepfathers, and the stepfathers may not be as tuned in and giving the same degree of bonding and guidance to their stepchildren on average. So I think that is a huge issue, but I think what's unappreciated is that it's, I think, an effect of what evolved to support the direct properly, in air quotes, directing the behavior of young males, which is the need of a dominance hierarchy where you have bigger, authoritative, and in the case of humans, mentoring and supportive males to show the young ones the way socially to compete for status,
Right.
which they have to do.
That's really interesting. All right, I hope you'll come back.
Okay,
We
thank you.
didn't even get to epigenetics. So epigenetics is, first of all, you should explain what they are in brief. But there was a moment there about 5 years ago, it feels like, that this was a whole bunch of people said, aha, this explains all of the things that we in the nature nurture debates and the problems with various communities that we've been waiting for. And it feels like it didn't quite live up to that hype, but I think it's a very interesting thing, which has to have some truth to it. Just how far you can take it, I don't know. So anyway,
okay. So I'll just say, just make me rush along if I take too long. So epigenetics, it's something like above the genome. So I have to say that testosterone and estrogen act on gene expression. So what they do is regulate differences in gene expression between males and females. So we have almost identical genes. That's not the issue. It's that testosterone will generally upregulate certain genes, like you have a beard, so it's upregulating genes in your skin and production of proteins that are going to facilitate beard growth. I don't have those same genes expressed in my facial skin because I don't have high levels of testosterone. Okay, so that in a sense is epigenetics, gene expression without changes to the underlying DNA. So you can have two babies in the womb with, you can have twins with the same DNA and you'd expect them to come out exactly the same, but they don't. And part of the reason is they're going to be in different positions in the womb and they may have different access to nutrients. So they have a slightly different environments, which means that different genes are going to be expressed early on. So, but what epigenetics is, generally refers to in this conversation is, suppose you have a lot of physical trauma in early development. What can happen is that certain genes that have important psychological effects can be permanently silenced or downregulated, and or
turned on, right?
Or turned on. So it can be a permanent, lifetime, lifelong change in gene expression, because we have critical periods where our genes in development, which could be in utero or especially in early childhood, because the organism, the animal, has to decide what the environment is like and what they need to do to develop to maximize survival and reproduction, so that decisions can't be made the whole through the rest of one's life, but that these decisions are made early on so that this animal has the best chance of surviving. So if you're in a very stressful environment, you might want to be hyper vigilant and have kind of something like high anxiety, because that's what you need to do to survive. So there'd be, say, increase or decrease in certain genes. But what happens is the promoter region of specific genes would kind of be capped. So it's inaccessible and it will be more tightly wrapped around the histones, which are these big proteins, so that it's inaccessible to expression, essentially, to being used to create new proteins. So epigenetics is a super powerful way of understanding one mechanism through which our environment, particularly early environment, can affect who we become physically and psychologically as adults. So some people who are always stressed out as adults and have trouble coping with adversity, it is a fact that their early environment, then their changes in gene expression, can affect their cortisol level. And their cortisol which is like a stress hormone or an energetic hormone, they might have an exaggerated cortisol response to the same kind of stressful stimulus as someone else who is going to be much more relaxed in the face of an environmental stressor. Whereas the person who had early trauma, who has their something like a cortisol receptor gene changes, that's like a whole other story. They might have trouble responding to that stressor because they don't have a typical stress response. They're going to have prolonged anxiety, like hypervigilance. Those people are more likely to commit suicide because they can't cope. And in a sense, it's not their fault. And
Right.
it's a difficult situation to address because it's as though they have different genes being expressed that interact with their environment and do affect personality and coping, and lots of different traits. That's just one example, but it's a real thing. It's exciting. It's important. And we need a lot more research.
Yeah. I mean, one way for the layman to think about it is imagine raising a kid from birth to 5 in Ukraine versus raising a kid in Santa Monica. The kid who's rushed down to a bomb shelter every third night and sees parents crying and wounded people, they're going to turn on some genes that the kid in Santa Monica is not going to have turned on. And
that's right.
And that stays with them. The last question on that, though, is there are some people who want to say that the epigenetic switch on, switch off stuff is heritable.
Yes.
Is it? Is it not?
Yeah. So the last time I think this is a rapidly evolving area of research, but from what I understand, it is heritable. And so what your mother or grandmother experienced can be transmitted. But I don't buy necessarily the body keeps the score version of this. These are called epigenetic marks. It's sort of mechanistically difficult to understand, but it appears that those marks are erased at conception, but then reestablished in the embryo and develop within the fetus. So there is some heritability there. We know this from non-human animals, and I'm not sure how well that understood that is in humans, but I'm not sure that we have super clear evidence about specifically how that happens across generations in humans. But I think it's totally reasonable to assume that to some extent it does, but I'm not sure that it has the profound impacts that people might assume, unless it's, but definitely the epigenetic effects of your own early environment, perhaps your mother's, I think are important. But if you're, say, abused or have, very trying circumstances in utero or as a kid, that's, I think, very important. And there are epigenetic marks that are detectable in adulthood that have been clearly related to, say, coping with stress and potentially some other things. But that's the area that I know about because that involves cortisol.
All right, we are going to call it there.
Okay.
Thank you so much for doing this, Carole Hooven.
Thank you for having me, Jonah.
Yep. Just remind, and I'll do a whole close when you're gone. But the book is T: The Story of Testosterone, the hormone that dominates and divides us. And welcome to AI, because I didn't get a chance to say that.
Thank you so much. I've loved it. Everybody's been wonderful.